The beginning to my homily was going to be different if Gonzaga didn't win yesterday. Most of you know that this is the first time that they've made it to the Final Four after so many tries. There are a lot of teams, though, that never even make it to the NCAAs. This year, Northwestern made it, got to the second round. Can't remember who they lost to, but in this kind of persistence, though, I think Gonzaga and other schools, they are so persistent and so resilient that every year when they don't make it to the Final Four, they get up and they try again and again and again. Persistence and resilience is kind of the key. Sometimes they have a wonderful coach, but they don't have the players, or sometimes they have the players and they don't have the coaching, and sometimes it's just a little bit of luck, or they come up against a tougher team. Whatever the reason, though, most teams don't make it to the NCAAs, and only one team ends up getting all the way to the championship. But try and try again is what they do. The reason I bring this up is because God is persistent. God is resilient. God never gives up on us. God is always with us, always calling upon us to come home, come back, time and time again. And during this season of Lent, we've been hearing the stories of how God constantly calls us home. And it starts all the way back in the first Sunday when we hear the story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had this absolutely perfect relationship with God. They have original grace. And in that original grace, they are absolutely shameless. They're naked in front of God because there's no barrier. There's nothing to stand between them. But in that first Sunday, we hear about the sin that breaks that relationship. They push themselves away from God, but God remains the same. God doesn't move. They do. As they push Him away, they're actually pushing themselves away. And the relationship has been fractured. But God doesn't give up. God calls forth Abraham and Sarah. In the second Sunday, we hear their story, called from their city to travel back to Eden, back to the promised land. Now, we hear that Abraham is the father of faith, but Abraham and Sarah, their faith couldn't sustain them. And they tried to find their own way to fulfill the promise. They, in a sense, broke trust with God. And so they're heading back to Eden. They're heading back to the promised land. But they never really make it there. Even though they settle in that land, their relationship with God remains fractured, so much so that their descendants end up slaves in Egypt. So last week, we hear the story of Moses. Moses comes to the people who are captives in the land of Egypt and leads them out into the wilderness. He's leading them back to the promised land. God walks with them. And yet their doubts, their self-centeredness, they can't sustain it. And so even though they are wandering out, they take 40 years to come to the promised land. And even in the promised land, their relationship with God is broken. So they're still wandering away from that perfect relationship, that relationship where God is with them. This morning in that first reading, we hear how God tries to call them back through His servant David. David, this perfect young man who will be the king of all of Israel. But we know the story of David. We know his weaknesses. We know that he committed adultery. We know that he had a man killed. We know that his son Absalom and his son Solomon broke trust with God. By the time they were finished, they'd broken all 10 of the commandments. And even though they had their kingdom, their relationship with God was fractured. Even though they were settled in the promised land, they were not in Eden. They ended up in exile in Babylon. Next week, we're going to hear the story of them traveling back to the promised land, past the dry bones in the desert. And God will remind them that He is calling them back to new life. And yet in that story of dry bones, the people's own doubts and fears get in the way, and they end up breaking trust again with God by abusing their relationships with each other, treating the poor unjustly. And so once again, Even though they are in the promised land, they are not in Eden. But God keeps coming back again and again and again. He's trying to get to the final four. In this case, the final one. He sends his own Son. And his Son is able to hold trust. And his Son is able to keep the faith and the commandments. His Son is able to hold all of that within him and trust in his Father. The incarnation, when God becomes flesh in Jesus Christ, allows Eden to be with us through him, with him, and in him. Yesterday, what was yesterday's date? Say it loud. It's the Feast of the Annunciation, just 9 months until Christmas. The Feast of the Annunciation falls within Lent because it reminds us that Christ's coming into our world, the incarnation at the Annunciation, was the moment when God overcomes all barriers and brings Eden to us in the form of Jesus Christ our Lord. And he walks our walk with us, and he spends his life upon us on the cross. And he continues to be incarnate in the Eucharist that we come to share. My brothers and sisters, we're in Eden because God is with us. No matter how far we wander, no matter how far we break trust, like the blind man, we're called to see. Not just to see what's in front of us, but to see what is within us. To see Christ with us in the Eucharist. To see Christ with us in this community of faith. To see Christ in the people we meet in the world. To see Christ and Eden and God walking with us at all times. The stories of our salvation history, the stories of us walking away from our relationship with God, is also the story of God remaining resilient and faithful in us. It's, in a sense, not our faith that saves us. It's God's faith in us that allows us to have Eden here and now at this altar, here and now in this church, and here and now in this world, no matter what goes sideways, no matter what goes wrong. So as we stand here in this midpoint of our Lenten season, as we stand here just a day away from the Annunciation, we remember that God is with us in the garden. He's with us on the journey. He's with us in the slavery. He's with us in our exile. God is with us always. And that's good news. God bless.